mass deportations. More from the demonstrations. We'll sit down with every Texan's chief of legislative affairs to talk about the current state of and future state of U.S. immigration. President Donald Trump has signed a slew of executive orders. We'll bring you more on how those orders could affect students right here at UT Austin. All of this coming up on Tower Talks. Good evening and welcome to Tower Talks, the show where we take a closer look at the stories affecting Texans, Austinites, and students right here at UT Austin. I'm Justin Doud, and tonight we have an expert panel lined up for you to talk about immigration. But before we get into that, a lot is going on around the world and in politics. The last week here in Austin has seen hundreds turn out to the Capitol to protest everything from Palestine to transgender rights to mass deportations. Last Wednesday, the nationwide 50-51 movement organized a protest against Project 2025. The demonstration here at the Texas Capitol was just one of many held around the country. TSTV News reporter Areebah Bharmal has more from the protest.
Chants and signs advocating for trans rights, Palestine, immigrant rights, and much more filled the south side of the Capitol complex and the streets of downtown Austin Wednesday.
For me, it's not so much just one topic, right? It's a human rights issue for me.
Cheryl Gonzalez was among the hundreds of demonstrators who came to the Capitol for the 50-51 movement's protest against Project 2025.
I've seen hate destroy us. I've seen hate kill us. And I've seen hate burn us to the ground.
The nationwide movement called for 50 protests across 50 states, all on one day. Information circulated on social media, which is exactly how Gonzalez's friend found out about it.
She let me know what was going on. She gave me the flyer, sent me the flyer through TikTok, and so we decided, hey, let's go, let's make a difference if we can.
Gonzalez, who's new to organizing, also came out hoping to garner attendance for her own educational rally in San Antonio.
This is just a human rights issue, and so I want to bring together some organizations if we can all coincide together and make this thing possible.
Reporting from the Capitol, Areebah Bharmal, TSTV News.
Areebah joins us now to talk more in depth about the 50-51 movement. Thanks for coming in on this evening.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you saw while you were at the protest?
Yeah, for sure. So there were a variety of causes represented through the different chants and the different signs that people were holding. Like you said before, it was kind of everything from Palestine to transgender rights to immigration, kind of all under that Protesting Project 2025 umbrella. We also saw a lot of opposition to the role Elon Musk has been playing in the current administration, and there were a lot of signs protesting him were also pretty prevalent throughout the demonstration.
Absolutely. And can you talk just a little bit more about what the 50-51 movement is more generally?
Yeah, so they've been largely spreading their message across social media. They call themselves a grassroots movement. They posted condemning Project 2025 back at the beginning of February before calling for this nationwide day of protest. They don't have central leadership. They're instead calling for people to kind of create connections and groups within their own communities. So the protest we saw Wednesday, like I said, was this nationwide call to action where they were calling for 50 protests in 50 states all in one day, so kind of 50-51 there. And we did see those protests occurring across the country as well as right here in Austin.
Right. So now that we've seen one in Austin, what's kind of next for the movement?
Yeah, so they've recently posted calling for another day of action nationwide coming up on Monday for President's Day. So they're calling once again for that nationwide movement to come out again and protest.
And we're seeing that right after the author of Project 2025 was confirmed for a cabinet position up in Congress. So this weekend we saw two more protests at the Capitol against mass deportations. Can you tell me a little bit more about kind of what happened Saturday morning?
Yeah, so we had two protests occur at the Capitol on Saturday. Saturday morning's protest was actually organized by a UT fraternity, so that was like a student-led demonstration over there. So over 150 students gathered first here on campus at Littlefield Fountain before going on a planned march down to the Capitol. So Sigma Lambda Beta was the fraternity that organized it, and we spoke with organizer Jovan Hernandez about the protest. He said the idea for the protest came from his own personal experiences growing up with undocumented parents. He also talked to us a little bit about his goals with the protest.
So the goal today is obviously make a voice for all the people that can, and also demand that ICE rates stop coming to campuses and that they stop around nationwide as well. You know, it's not fair for families to be broken apart.
And Hernandez was the one who led that march over to the Capitol with chants along the way.
So when you got to the Capitol, what did you see happen?
Yeah, so protesters arrived at the Capitol. They went around to the south side, and we had students speaking and chanting in both English and Spanish, kind of speaking on this mass deportation thing that they were protesting. So we had one student in particular talk about how she was stopped by police despite her status as a citizen, and students were speaking about their personal experiences. We also talked to a law student who was in attendance. She heard about the protest through a Latino organization she's in. Her name is Carolina. She has to only be identified by her first name. And she said that she prioritizes education when she comes to events like Saturday morning's protest.
A lot of people don't know their rights, don't know the power behind their vote, don't know the power behind their voice, and to educate everybody on what to do if they're in a situation where even though they might be a citizen, they're stopped by immigration, customs, and enforcement, and protect themselves because some serious stuff is going on.
So you said that the protest started at Littlefield Fountain. How did the university respond to the demonstration, considering that it started on campus?
Yeah, so I'm going to go a little bit of a history lesson here,
Sure.
But last semester, as you know, Justin, the university established the Event Readiness and Response Unit within the Office of the Dean of Students with the goal of kind of providing support to organizations that were planning demonstrations. And so we've seen these organizations this unit reach out to organizations that are planning protests on campus and kind of open that dialogue to have communication between the two. You and I personally have seen that at other protests and demonstrations that we have attended this semester through our own coverage. So they seem to reach out to organizers, kind of talk to them, and then they attend the protests or demonstrations as well and kind of keep an eye on things. We've seen Joe Labruto, who is kind of in charge of this unit. We've seen him speaking with organizers at these events and then kind of hanging out to keep an eye on things as well. And Saturday was no different in that regard. We spoke with Hernandez about this as well. He told us that the Event Readiness and Response team reached out to him and offered UTPD's support with the demonstration. And that's exactly what we saw, with UTPD then helping the demonstration, kind of guiding them to the Capitol as well. They passed these two major streets along the way at MLK Boulevard and 15th Street, and when they reached MLK Boulevard, UTPD blocked off traffic to allow them to cross, and when they reached 15th Street, UTPD, in combination with the DPS state troopers, helped the protesters get across there as well.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, we saw that collaboration kind of taking place between the two.
Right, and it's my understanding that the Event Readiness and Response Group, in this instance, like you were describing, actually reached out to the group first. It wasn't the group that initiated contact. Is that right?
That's correct from my understanding, yes, and that's something we've seen in the past as well. We saw that happen with an SDS demonstration you and I covered earlier last semester, I believe it was, where, again, Joe Labruto reached out to the organizers to open that communication and kind of figure out how they were going to have this demonstration. In that particular instance, they were trying to deliver a letter to the university president, and we did see a little bit of friction and disagreement with how that letter would be delivered on the day, but that wasn't something we really saw on Saturday, where it seemed like both groups seemed to be working together pretty smoothly.
Right. Now, after the demonstration concluded at the Capitol, what happened?
Yeah, so at the conclusion of the protest, I believe they were supposed to disperse from the Capitol, but instead they all kind of marched back together. I spoke with Hernandez after, and he said that march back to Littlefield Fountain was kind of unplanned. It was a bit more spur of the moment, but we still did see UTPD block off MLK Boulevard to allow the demonstrators to cross over again. So they followed the same route back, ended up back at Littlefield Fountain, and then dispersed from there.
Absolutely. And later Saturday afternoon, there was another protest at the Capitol. Who was that one organized by?
Yeah, the second protest took place a little bit later in the day. It was organized by Austin's chapter of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. They gathered at the southern gate of the Capitol before marching through the streets of downtown. And Justin, you spoke with an organizer from PSL about that march, so what did they have to say? Yeah,
he told me that it was unplanned and relatively spontaneous, a lot like the march back to Littlefield Fountain. And it was meant to be kind of a sign of strength and resistance. He reiterated that there are going to be more events in the future from the PSL. This is by no means the last, and that people could continue to show up in support regardless of any negative response from either law enforcement or people who witnessed the protest.
How was that police response on Saturday?
It was very strong. At one point, there were 8 squad cars just following the crowd, in addition to others that were throughout the streets of downtown Austin. But it was also very peaceful. Officers were primarily conducting traffic. No arrests were made, despite the spontaneous nature of the march.
There was one small incident, however, before the group began marching when they were still at the Capitol. Can you talk to us a little about that?
Sure. So before the march, when the group was gathered in front of the Capitol, a car stopped at a red light and it began honking in support. When the light turned green, the car began to drive forward, and a DPS trooper who was watching the protest pulled behind the car and initiated a traffic stop. A group of the protesters, about 15, walked over to the parking lot that the vehicle had been stopped in, and shortly after they got there, the 2 state troopers that had joined drove away in their vehicles. So the driver said that they told her she was violating a noise ordinance, but they let her off with a warning when the group showed up.
Yeah, and after the march, when the protesters arrived back at the Capitol, what kind of happened then?
Yeah, so the group went back to chanting for a little while before some members formed a drum circle. Eventually, a man with an effigy or a figure of Donald Trump placed the figure in the circle. Protesters began to jump on it before one person actually ended up stabbing it with some sort of wooden stake. So after that, they began to clean up the remains of the figure, and then they dispersed not long after that.
And the demonstrations don't seem to be slowing down. We mentioned earlier that 5051 has another one planned for next week, and we also know that Students for a Democratic Society, as well as the Palestine Solidarity Committee, also have protests planned within the next week for various causes.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, Areebah. Coming up, we have an expert panel here to discuss immigration. Stay tuned. Tower Talks will be right back.
13 of the 48 club sports offered by the university now require students to submit proof of sex assigned at birth.
I know deep down they would probably want to stay with the university.
No way in hell anybody's going to tell my daughters what to do with their bodies.
This state is one of the worst in child education.
We can't take it anymore, seeing those scenes.
Going to Hillel on Friday night, all my family members kept texting me not to go.
There's a huge housing crisis in Austin. Do you have a plan in place to address this issue?
Determined to start your day well? We're up bright and early. From the enriching local stories to the weather forecast later in the day. Rain or shine, at Good Morning Longhorns, we got you covered. Comprised of a studious reporting staff going lengths to get that scoop, and a talented technical team to enhance your screen visually. As a fellow Longhorn, your mornings are better with us. So start your day the Vivo way. Good Morning Longhorns, Wednesdays at 7 a.m. Central Time on TSTV.
Welcome back to Tower Talks. Tonight I'm joined by Luis Figueroa, Chief of Legislative Affairs at Every Texan and a UT Law alum. Luis, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk about immigration tonight, which is a complex and deeply layered topic that could be and has been discussed for years, even decades. Unfortunately, we've got about 25 minutes, but we're going to try and get to cover as much as we can in that period of time and clear up as much as we can. So can we start off with you just telling me a little bit about the work that Every Texan does. Why take a public policy focus?
Yeah, absolutely. So we used to be called the Center for Public Policy Priorities. Now we rebrand as Every Texan. We were founded by the Benedictine nuns in Boerne, Texas, and they saw that their patients needed more than just physical care. They needed policy change, and that's been our driving spirit. They were radical nuns who realized that people needed access to health care, they needed education, we wanted a progressive tax structure, and more recently we've gone into voting rights immigration as that becomes an important part of the Texas fabric. And fundamentally, we realized that we're just trying to make a better life for every Texan, and that's kind of where our driving mission is. And so we do legislative advocacy, we do reports, and we try to educate the community where we can.
That's kind of an amazing origin story, if you were going to have one. So what's Every Texan's approach to policy advocacy in the 89th legislative session? Are there any kind of priorities that you have kind of locked in on as a focus?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we work on a lot of issues, but fundamentally, we want to make sure that there are resources there for education. We want to make sure there's access there for health care. So specifically when we talk about education, we're talking about increasing what's called the basic allotment so that there's enough funding for all school, rise up all boats. When we're talking about health care, we're talking about access to Medicaid, access to the programs that will be able to, so that people can have access to affordable health care. Medicaid expansion isn't really on the table this session, but we do know there are other things that would reduce the burdens and other red tape to get people access to health care. On the immigration front, we're really trying to reduce some of the amount of waste that we're spending on it. We're spending $6.5 billion with a B on border security in Texas. You mentioned that to other states, and they think that must be the federal budget. There's no way you're spending that just in one state. States like Arizona do it for about a third of the cost and get about the same results. So we're spending a lot of money on border security. We'd love to see that money refocus on education. We'd love to see that money focus on water and other things. So those are a few of the issues we work on. But fundamentally, we're there to make sure that we can have Texans thrive and really focus on the kids and the health needs of the state.
Right. Can you describe some of the work that you did with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, which you were with before education?
Yeah, sure. So early in my career, after I graduated law school, most of my career was at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF. I did litigation and I did legislative advocacy. We were heavily involved in a lot of the school finance cases that led to equity. We were involved in a lot of the immigration fights. There used to be an ordinance in Farmers Branch in Dallas that prevented immigrants from being able to rent houses or apartments there. We were able to defeat that in the federal courts. So issues like that, and I would drive up and down from San Antonio, Austin, and be a voice for the Latino community in the Texas halls and in the legislature, and really advocate for that community.
So you're no stranger to Capitol Hill.
No, I've been doing the Capitol since early 2000s. My first official session was 2005, and then I got to work inside the Senate in 2013 and got to see a little bit behind the curtain, so to speak.
Right. So as far as immigration priorities in the 89th legislature, what are you hoping to see this session, either in terms of bills that you would want to see passed or the mitigation of legislation passed that goes against the priorities of every Texan?
Yeah, in this political climate, it's a lot of defensive work. Sure. We're trying to make sure that immigrants aren't scapegoated, that they aren't blamed for social ills, and that their fundamental rights are protected. Every person in the United States has some basic human rights, whether they're 4th or 5th or 14th Amendment rights. For example, birthright citizenship is one that's been a long-standing right, that if you are born in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. And those fundamental rights are under attack, both federally and in the state. And so we're there to protect those rights and advocate for that community, because a lot of times they don't have a voice. Many of them are undocumented, they don't have the right to vote, many of them are hiding in the shadows, and we are trying to give them just the fundamental human rights that anybody would deserve. Proactively, we'd love to see a few things. We'd love to, provide some access to a driver's permit. We know a lot of undocumented are having to drive without insurance because they can't have access, they can't afford the insurance. So it'd be great if they could at least have a permit to allow them to drive. But we know politically that's going to be a tough hill to battle this session. So we're going to be doing a lot of defense.
Right. So let's dive into immigration as it stands now in the U.S.
A lot of
politicians talk of an immigration crisis or surge of migrants entering the U.S. According to the Pew Research Center, record numbers of border crossings were reported at the end of 2023, but numbers in 2024 plummeted to their lowest point since 2020, lower than at some points in President Trump's first term. So do you think that there is an immigration crisis, as it's been called, or do you think that that's kind of a misstatement?
I do think it's been overstated, and I do think that immigration very much stems not from the domestic policy about walls or troops on the border. That doesn't seem to have a real impact on the number of migrants crossing. What does have a huge impact is the work the things that are happening in the country of origin, right? Is there a civil war? Are the gangs having a bigger impact there? And a big part of it is the role that the Mexican government plays. You know, are they restricting access on their side of the border? Are they working with the United States government, or are they working against? And then the other big part of it is our own policy in terms of how people are able to access our system of government, right? So the Biden administration implemented a phone app, right, the CBP-1, that allowed people to apply for asylum on the Mexican side of the government. That had a huge impact in reducing the number of entry through a non-port of entry, right? So things like that can make a big difference, but fundamentally it's what's going on in the country of origin, right? If we having climate control or climate crises across in different parts, if we're having wars, civil wars, if there's hurricanes, that's going to influence the migrants in the United States, and that has nothing to do with whether or not we have 5,000 troops on the border or 10,000 troops on the border. At the end of the day, it's mainly about the fundamental idea that people are going to go where they feel safe, where they can find security, both economically and physical safety, and that's been the case for the whole history of the world.
Right. And that CBP app was shut down on the first day and very early in the current president's administration, giving people less than an hour's notice when appointments were canceled.
That's right.
So just a bit of a large question to kind of start with. A common argument used in discussions around illegal immigration is that those wishing to enter the United States from abroad should simply, and I quote, do it the right way. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Can you describe what the legal immigration process looks like and what some of the challenges are with trying to immigrate legally?
Yeah, I mean, so first I'd say a lot of times there is no line to get into, right? So in order to come into the United States, to begin with, you need some type of visa. Visas are usually granted to people who have some type of work authorization, or the company has authorized or applied for a visa in the first hand. For many times those quotas are maxed out and there just is not a visa available. Even if you can get a visa, in order to get in line to become a legal permanent resident, the green card, so to speak, you need someone to petition for you. So you need a family member or you need a business to petition for you. If you don't have that family member or it's not a close enough relationship, then there is no line for you to get in. And even if you do have that family or that business, the length of time is sometimes completely unfeasible. Sometimes 20 years or plus to migrate, and by that time, obviously the economic situation may not be viable for that person. So many times there is no line, and then when there is a line, it's not a feasible line. I think that's one thing that we have to explain. And I think the other part of it is that doesn't address the situation where someone is coming in because they just had a hurricane in their country of origin, right? There is no line to get into in that situation. There is complete devastation in your home country, and there's a hope and a dream to come to the United States and fulfill what many refugees, what many migrants in the history of the United States have experienced, which is hope. The hope that the United States brings because of our economic security and because of the dream of being able to rise above your station, so to speak, right? And so without those systems in place, America is not what it stands to be if we're completely restricting asylees, if restricting people from temporary status, if we're saying no, no, no. We are just not the country that we claim to be. We're not the country of freedom at that point.
Yeah. What are the most common reasons that people usually seek to immigrate into the United States at times illegally? You were talking a lot about troubles in the country of origin.
Yeah.
Is that the number one cause?
It's interesting. I'm from El Paso, Texas, and there is a shelter there that's come under a lot of attacks from the Attorney General. And when you ask the director of that shelter about the migrants now versus the migrants when he started it back in the 80s, He said the reasons are always the same. They're either coming here for safety or they're coming here for economic, security, because they just have no other choice economically, or because they are fear for their life in their country of origin. He said that has remained the same from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. What has changed is our own policies in America. The reasons for migrants coming, that hasn't changed.
So apart from limited exceptions to asylum, when an emergency situation like that pops up, there's no kind of action that can be taken to immigrate into the United States?
So there used to be, right? So, in many cases, presidents have granted temporary protective status in those situations. You can also grant asylum. You don't actually have to grant it. You could at least allow for the petition, the process to go forward. So many times the migrants would come seeking out law enforcement, right? There's this idea that migrants are coming over to provide, do harm or to attack the United States. We've heard some of this very divisive language. In many cases, the asylees were looking for law enforcement so they could claim asylum. And so in that process, you have to prove up, your case that you are being prosecuted on a specific account, whether it's your race, religion, or some type of political group that you're part of. And then you have your case before the judge. When we don't allow for asylum to even be processed, when we don't allow TPS, when you take away those processes, when you take away humanitarian relief, you're leaving migrants with no choice. Either die in their country of origin, remain in a country where you have no resources, or try to migrate through a non-lawful process, which is, the tunnels or climbing over the wall or in the deserts of Arizona. And many of them die in that process, and it's a horrible, inhumane way to do migration. But for many migrants, it's the only choice.
Right. So, kind of a question in the same vein. What are some of the most common misconceptions that people have about immigration into the U.S. and about immigrants living in the U.S., apart from the accessibility of the legal immigration process?
Yeah, there's a couple. I think we hit on a couple of them. One, the idea of the line, right? That there's this line that you can get into, and if they just waited a few years, they could just come in through a process. And unfortunately, because we've never done comprehensive immigration reform, and we've only done enforcement, that line has not existed. The second thing I think I would say is a big misconception is this idea of crime. Migrants are actually the least likely to commit crimes in the United States. You can imagine why. The consequences for them are pretty large: deportation, removal from the United States. They want to usually fly under the radar, and so as a result, they have one of the lowest crime rates, when in comparison to residents and U.S. citizens. So I think that's another myth out there. And for the most part, migrants have all said that they're seeking the same thing, right? Which is, able to access jobs and work and provide for their families, and in some cases education, right? We know that there are quite a few dreamers in Texas, here at UT, who are just trying to better their lives. And I've gotten to know a lot of these students over my career, and many of them are nurses. I bought my car from one of them. He was the top seller in his dealership. They're just incredibly hardworking, and they're just trying to do the best they can in the situation they're given. And every year, they don't know what their status is going to be. DACA could be taken away at any time. They could lose their employment authorization. They could be deported. But beside all that, they're thriving. They're working in the United States and doing what we've all asked them to do, which is get good grades and work in the United States and do the best for their community.
Right. So finally, the final question for immigration right now. Legislators from border communities have continuously talked about the strain that immigration has put on their constituents and on their districts. You have experience working in the state capitol for a Texas senator who represented the people of El Paso. Can you talk a little bit about what it's truly like on the ground in a border town, both in regards to challenges stemming from immigration, but also just about what people may not understand about those communities?
What's really interesting, I'm from El Paso. We did a big listening tour in the Rio Grande Valley. They all say the same thing. They are one of the safest communities in all of the United States. El Paso was consistently in top 3, top 2s, a lot of times number 1. Safest city in the United States for a city of its size, based on FBI and crime statistics. We went down to the Rio Grande Valley. They were going to have this big convention of clerks. And everyone was scared to come down because it was going to be this, dangerous place. And only half of them came down. They were worried about buying, they should have security guards and walkie-talkies. And everyone was like, "Are you crazy? we're one of the safest areas you could ever have been. And when they did have the convention, everyone had a great time. It went great, and everyone was talking about, when can we do it again? We got to do it again here in the Rio Grande Valley. So I think this perception of migrants leading to crime and drugs and all that just doesn't bear out in the border community. Many migrants are passing through in order to get to their families, to take to their jobs, to get to their factories, to work on the jobs that many Americans don't want to do. And the result is that they're very much welcomed in these border communities because we are part of those communities, and because we realize that they make our communities a lot of times safer. When the community and the police are working with the migrants, all of our communities are safer. When we try to do enforcement only, when we try to make local police become immigration officers, we make DPS immigration officers, we're forcing people more into the shadows. We're making cartels, richer because they get to charge more, and we're making all of our communities more dangerous as they go through more tunnels, as they bury through, different methods of going through the desert, of trying to get through barbed wire. All of that just makes the whole community feel less safe, and just it's not really what the border community is about.
Right, it kind of amplifies the challenges.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to move now towards talking about some of the recent political developments around immigration since the new administration took office. So let's start with the increase in arrests by federal law enforcement, including Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. The Washington Post reported that field offices are being required to meet daily arrest quotas, despite agency policy to the contrary. The result is a mandate requiring over 1,000 arrests a day, and we've seen arrests here in Austin, as TSTV News reported in late January. Additionally, the governor authorized the Texas National Guard to make immigration arrests internally within the state. So generally, do you think that the increase in arrests is necessary, or the most effective way to address what politicians have frequently called a migrant crisis?
Yeah, the bottom line is enforcement-only approaches have just not worked, right? So we go back all the way in 1996. We passed two very strong enforcement laws that, put more deportations for certain crimes. Since then, every president has increased the number of Border Patrol, ICE. Obama was known as the deporter-in-chief for a long time because of the secure communities when a lot of people were being removed. All of that approaches haven't really solved the issue, right? We still continue to see large migration. We still continue to see the need for migrants, coming to the United States, and we still fundamentally, the businesses and the farmers all still need that migrant labor force, right? So the real answer is, comprehensive immigration reform, where we create a path for these migrants. And yes, there can be a security component to that, but if you don't provide a path, if you don't provide a way in for the economic needs and for the security needs and for the asylum needs, you're just going to continue to see a cycle of these problems. So to me, the increasing of Border Patrol and militarization of the border is just making the situation, one, it's political, right? They want it for the cameras, and they want to make it look like they're doing tough things. But it's also resulting in making our border communities feel less safe. It's resulting in the cartels being able to charge more, and it's resulting in more deaths of migrants themselves. And so it's really a lose-lose, in my opinion. And also the amount of money we're spending into it. As I mentioned, $6.5 billion that could be put into education, could be put in rural hospitals, into water. All of that would be a better use of money, in our opinion, than militarization of the border. And then now we're doubling that on the federal side with the amount of money we're going to be spending, sending migrants to Latin America and Central America, chartering these flights. It's a large resource, and the detention centers that are going to be built. I think we could just reuse that money in a way that we could, have a much bigger effect, reduce crime, and then, provide this comprehensive immigration reform, which is fundamentally what the American people have asked for, are solutions, long-term solutions to migration, not just short-term political gains.
Right. So what effect do these actions have on communities both in Texas and around the nation?
It's fear. It's creating fear everywhere. We're now seeing children scared to go to their schools, people scared to go to the hospitals. We, potentially may see a flu epidemic that's going to go around. And if we tell migrants that they can't go to the hospital, what does that result in, right? It's going to make all of us sick. It's going to spread these diseases. Or if it's education. So if they're not in school, where are they? They're on the streets. They're doing things that, you know, they're stuck at home. They're putting everyone at risk potentially, instead of learning things and becoming part of the American culture. So all of it just has a negative impact that's long-term, just going to hurt not just the migrants, but our communities and the nation as a whole. It has a cascading effect that I think is just going to be a long-term harm for the United States. And then we talk about the farms and the crops that are just going to go to waste because they don't have enough workers. The factories that are not going to be able to process their products because they don't have enough workers. All of that is just going to have a negative impact on our community. For what reason? Because of fear. Because we're fear of people who are different from us. Because we're fear of, you know, the people from different countries. And because political fear has resulted in electoral gains. So hopefully we'll start flipping that script a little bit, changing the narrative as people start seeing the effects and the impact. And we'll start realizing that the solution comes with not just enforcement only, but with real comprehensive immigration reform.
Right. Well, President Donald Trump issued an executive order, and you touched on this earlier, to eliminate birthright citizenship, effectively changing the modern interpretation of the 14th Amendment. It's been blocked by 3 federal judges so far. It is likely to work its way up through the appellate court system. Can you kind of elaborate on the discrepancy in interpretation of the 14th Amendment between the Trump administration and then the precedent in U.S. courts for people, you know, that haven't followed why the administration believes that they can issue that order? Testing you on your constitutional...
I have it here. I mean, I can't say it better than Judge Cogner, Ronald Reagan appointee, who sits in Seattle. He was the first judge to strike it down. He said, "I've been on the bench for over 4 decades. I can't remember another case where the question presented was as clear." He says, "Where were the lawyers when the decision to sign an executive order was made?" The judge asked. He said it boggled his mind that a member of the bar would claim this order was constitutional. This is a fundamental right coming after the Civil War, right? It was a way to end the 3/5 rule that slaves and Native Americans weren't whole Americans. And so we realized that anyone in the United States after the 14th Amendment was going to be part of the United States. If they're born here, you're an American citizen. That's what separates us from a lot of other countries, because we believe that Americans, as Americans, if you're born here, you are entitled to all those rights. So it really is a long-term precedent based on a war, based on the Civil War, based on the big war. And so to fly that in its face and just try to do it through an executive order, not a constitutional amendment, not a law through Congress, just try to sign a piece of paper and just upend our entire Constitution, was pretty dramatic and pretty extreme. And I think you know, all the courts have been pretty clear on this one. The precedent is pretty clear on this one. It's unconstitutional, and that's not just an opinion. That's really, you know, fact.
It's a lot of advocates for the executive order have pointed out other countries' practices,
sure.
and how they're notably different from ours. So it's interesting to hear you point out this, you know, that we are different and that's a positive.
Yeah, it's what separates us, right? And there was a war about it. So it was a big civil war, and it was because, you know, when our country was founded, we were basically said slaves and Native Americans weren't Americans, and we fought a war and said, you know what, we're going to change the way we act about this. We're not going to have a second-class citizen. We're not going to have people who are born in the United States not have a country. And so we changed our laws, and we did it the right way. We did it through a constitutional amendment. It was the 14th Amendment of the United States, and it's been the law ever since.
Right. So what would the effect of the eradication of birthright citizenship be on people within the United States? And then how do you think that it would change the view of the citizenship process?
You become a second-class citizen, right? So all of a sudden you're born in the United States. You may not be recognized in the country of your parents. You may not have any relationship with them. We know a lot of dreamers who were not necessarily born in the United States, but were brought with their parents when they crossed. Don't speak the country. They don't speak the language of their home country. They've you know, done the national pledge and don't have any, you know, connection to their country of origin. And so to tell someone like that to say, you know what, yeah, you've been in the United States your whole life. You may not know your country of origin, but you know, we're going to send you back over there and good luck, figure it out. It's pretty inhumane, it's pretty impractical, and it's pretty cruel. And so this would be one step further. Not only would it be for someone who was brought over as a child, it'd be for someone who was actually born in the United States and say, yeah, you were born in the United States, but no, I'm sorry, we're going to make you go learn another country and figure all that out on your own with no connections and perhaps maybe even no family there. Who knows what the situation is. But that would just be, you know, it's immoral, it's unconstitutional, and it's impractical.
Right. So one discussion point that's gotten traction in recent months with the release of the book, Everyone Who Is Here Is Gone, by Jonathan Blitzer, great book, is the role the United States played historically in perpetuating or creating some of the circumstances that have led to the increase in migration seen in recent decades. So President Trump announced plans to reduce the staff of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, from around 10,000 globally to 290 or so. And earlier today, Texas Congressman Chip Roy and Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene filed a bill to abolish the agency on the House floor. So what effect could that have on further perpetuating those circumstances that lead to higher immigration, if any?
Yeah, I mean, this one's really tough because, you know, the United States has always been seen as that place for refugee, right? For many countries, you know, you talk about the Afghan refugees, for example, 1,660 Afghan refugees were cleared for resettlement. And all of a sudden that door closed. We know that there's a lot of Christians who are persecuted in the Middle East, and they come to the United States after after being persecuted. And so, you know, President Trump has said he would defend persecuted Christians, and yet here he is closing the door to the refugee settlement, closing the door to U.S. aid to countries where those you know, people who are persecuted would receive some relief. It really is a real shift in the idea of America being that beacon of light. It's really shutting that door down and saying we're going to become isolationists, we're going to close our doors, we're going to stop giving aid, we are not going to be that beacon anymore. We're really going to really fundamentally change our role in the global affairs of the world. And so I find it really sad because, you know, I think a lot of us grew up in that idea of America being that light, being that moral light, and, you know, that we've not always been the good guys in every side, and there's certainly been mistakes made, but the idea was that we were going to try to be a beacon. We were going to try to help provide that aid. We were going to try to be a world leader with the moral high ground, and that's going to be a really hard position to retake after this administration.
Right. Continuing with domestic policy that, in a sense, you know, affects foreign policy, the administration announced plans to take the controversial prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, that historically housed and currently houses individuals accused of having ties to terrorist organizations for years, and in some instances decades at a time, without trial, and to relocate that or reallocate that space to house undocumented immigrants awaiting deportation. The facility was used as a migrant detention facility in the 1990s, which was the last time that it held the number of people the administration has announced are expected to be held again, around 30,000, a large portion of which will again be held in tent-like structures erected for this purpose. For reference, in the past 2 decades, the section of Guantanamo Bay that is used to house migrants has held an average of around 100 people at a time. There's a lot up in the air about this, including the constitutionality of it, but migrants are already being sent there by military transport. So assuming that it were to continue, what effect do you think that it would have both on immigration into the U.S. and on those that are held at Guantanamo?
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to have a big impact on migrants actually coming to the United States. Like I said, the factors that they're fleeing, right, whether they're fleeing from gang violence or a hurricane or a natural disaster or a civil war, or they just can't feed their family, you know, I don't know if you're telling them, well, you may or may not get sent to Guantanamo Bay is going to have really any type of deterrent effect. Most of these deterrent effects haven't had a big impact. I also, to my understanding, there's just not going to be, the facility is not ready to house that large number of migrants. So I am curious to see how it plays out, if there's a constitutional challenge there, what the structures look like, whether they'll have access to be able to, you know, make their immigration claims depending on their situation and how the access to attorneys will work and how the access to care will work. And so I think there's a lot of open questions about it, but potential for a lot of abuse. And those abuses and those stories I think are going to come out eventually, and I think we're going to be really embarrassed by it.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us, Luis. I could talk about this all day.
Absolutely.
But I really appreciate you coming out late on a Monday night. So when Tower Talks returns, we are going to talk about executive orders beyond immigration. And Tower Talks will be right back.
Thirteen of the 48 club sports offered by the university now require students to submit proof of sex assigned at birth.
I know deep down they would probably want to stay with the university.
No way in hell anybody's going to tell my daughters what to do with their bodies.
This state is one of the worst in child education.
We can't take it anymore, seeing those scenes.
Going to Hillel on Friday night, all my family members kept texting me not to go.
There's a huge housing crisis in Austin. Do you have a plan in place to address this issue?
Determined to start your day well? We're up bright and early. From the enriching local stories to the weather forecast later in the day. Rain or shine, at Good Morning Longhorns, we got you covered. Comprised of a studious reporting staff going lengths to get that scoop, and a talented technical team to enhance your screen visually. As a fellow Longhorn, your mornings are better with us. So start your day the Vivo way. Good Morning Longhorns, Wednesdays at 7 a.m. Central Time on TSTV.
Welcome back to Tower Talks. Higher education has been a major topic of discussion across the political spectrum. Today we'll be taking a closer look at some executive orders that affect college students across the states. And we have our correspondent Kai Fong to tell us a little more about each one. Thank you so much for coming out, Kai.
Thanks for having me.
So President Trump signed an executive order his first day in office to roll back diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the federal government. So-called DEI programs include affirmative action, which proponents argue fight discrimination. The order not only affects the federal government, but also contractors and grantees. In the executive order, the administration argued that those programs are divisive and unconstitutional. This comes after the Texas legislature banned DEI in higher education last year through Senate Bill 17. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this order means?
When describing legislation to be the reverse, President Trump's executive order only referenced another order signed by President Biden in 2021. However, a fact sheet released by the White House on January 22nd stated that an executive order signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 during the Civil Rights Movement was also revoked. That executive order prohibited discrimination based on race, creed, sex, or national origin in the federal government and federal contractors. The move by President Trump is the latest challenge in a trend that began in the 1990s when voters in multiple states voted for bans on affirmative action. In 2023, the Supreme Court banned affirmative action in college admissions. Many companies are scrapping their DEI programs amidst the political controversy, while others are doubling down on their commitment to them. Proponents of DEI argue that scrapping initiatives will lead to negative consequences such as increased polarization and costly litigation battles in court.
Right, and on February 5th, President Trump signed an executive order titled Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports. The order is meant to, quote, protect opportunities for women and girls to compete in safe and fair sports, end quote. by excluding transgender women from competing against biological women in organized sports. The main focus of the executive order is athletic programs at educational institutions. Can you expand some on the order and on how the NCAA has responded in colleges?
Yeah, so the administration claimed that its enforcement is in accordance with Title IX of the Education Amendments Act of 1972. Title IX outlawed discrimination based on sex in educational institutions that receive federal funding. According to the executive order, institutions found in violation of the order could lose federal funding. Nowhere has this been more controversial than in sports. In 2022, the University of Pennsylvania swimmer Leah Thomas, an Austin native, won the NCAA swimming championship, becoming the first transgender woman to do so. According to NBC, her victory led to international controversy about the fairness of having individuals born as biological males compete against athletes born as biologically female. Eventually, it led to an unsuccessful legal battle at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Switzerland over Miss Thompson's right to compete as a woman. While trans women and women undergoing hormonal therapy cannot compete in women's sports, according to the NCAA, anybody who identifies as a man can participate competitively in men's sports at the collegiate level. Currently, according to NPR, there are around 10 transgender collegiate athletes nationwide. While opponents of trans participation in women's sports lauded the executive order as a victory for female athletes, LGBTQ advocacy groups oppose the move as discriminatory against trans women and potentially invasive for all women who participate in competitive sports.
And on Saturday, federal judge Paul Engelmeyer of the Southern District Court of New York temporarily blocked billionaire Elon Musk and other special government employees of the U.S. Doge service from accessing sensitive Treasury Department records, including the financial information of American citizens. According to the New York Times, it is one of 40 lawsuits lodged against the Trump administration by state attorney generals, labor unions, and nonprofits in a bid to counter the rapid pace of Mr. Trump's reshaping of the federal government. 9 of those cases have resulted in temporary injunctions against the implementation of executive orders. What are some of those orders, and what's the latest on the proceedings?
So judicial orders have stopped the removal of birthright citizenship and paused the release of a list containing FBI personnel who were a part of January 6 investigations. They also include halting the transfer of trans women in the federal prison system to men's facilities. Mr. Trump's attempts to cut the size of the workforce for the U.S. Agency for International Development were also paused, as well as other attempts at unilaterally reducing federal spending and the federal workforce. With Republicans holding the presidency and majorities in both the Senate and the House, the main battle over the implementation of Mr. Trump's policies has occurred in courtrooms across the nation. Vice President J.D. Vance added to the controversy by releasing a statement on X, formerly Twitter, stating that judges do not have the authority to challenge the president on executive power. Some have pointed out that that statement could invite a constitutional crisis over checks and balances and the power of the judiciary.
Thank you very much for joining me, Kai. You cleared up a lot. After the break, we'll be taking a look a little closer to home at the Texas legislature. Tower Talks will be right back.
Thirteen of the 48 club sports offered by the university now require students to submit proof of sex assigned at birth.
I know deep down they would probably want to stay with the university.
No way in hell anybody's going to tell my daughters what to do with their bodies.
This state is one of the worst in child education.
We can't take it anymore, seeing those scenes.
Going to Hillel on Friday night, all my family members kept texting me not to go.
There's a huge housing crisis in Austin. Do you have a plan in place to address this issue?
Determined to start your day well? We're up bright and early. From the enriching local stories to the weather forecast later in the day. Rain or shine, at Good Morning Longhorns, we got you covered. Comprised of a studious reporting staff going lengths to get that scoop, and a talented technical team to enhance your screen visually. As a fellow Longhorn, your mornings are better with us. So start your day the Vivo way. Good morning.
Welcome back to Tower Talks. Joining me now is TSTV News reporter McKenna Valentine, who's here to help me break down some updates from the Texas legislature this session. McKenna, welcome on.
Thank you. So Texas's primarily Republican legislature is zeroing in on lessons taught at public colleges, targeting an assumed liberal bias.
It's predicted that the legislature will limit the influence of professors, many of who are classified as, quote, woke activists, unquote. The legislature is also aiming to combat anti-Semitism by limiting pro-Palestinian protests. This is expected to bring up questions of free speech once again. If passed, both Senate Bill 326 and House Bill 2102 would make it a requirement for universities to use the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism to expel a student. Opponents of the bill argue that this could lead to further discussions of free speech. According to a report by the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, the legislature also has plans to improve financial aid benefits for students. This includes $11.5 billion that have been set aside for fiscal year 2025. House Bill 820, for example, would ensure that students can receive food stamps during breaks in the academic calendar. Additionally, the legislature hopes to eventually expand this funding from just public universities to transfer students and private universities as well. Despite past DEI bans, the legislature is concerned that schools are not complying with the regulations. As a result, Texas lawmakers are proposing House Bill 2311, which would eliminate previously allowed exemptions, correlating a university's funding to its compliance. An additional piece of legislation has also been filed that would prohibit degrees and courses related to LGBTQ+ studies. Lawmakers also hope to amend the process of developing curriculum. Some bills may also address universities' hiring processes, such as Senate Bill 452, which would require prior approval from the Board of Regents before a university hires a department chair.
Right, and the Texas Senate passed Senate Bill 2 on Wednesday. SB 2 is an initiative to use taxpayer dollars to fund accredited private schools in Texas. The bill was passed with a 19-12 vote, with all Democratic senators and one Republican voting against it. Along with private school funding, SB 2 would prompt the creation of an education savings account program, or an ESA, with annual distributions including $10,000 for each student who attends an accredited private school, $11,500 for each student with a disability who attends a private school, and $2,000 for each homeschooled student for use on educational expenses. Opponents of school vouchers express concern that funding for private education will limit public school funding, citing that public schools are already facing budget deficits. The Senate Republicans' victory comes days after Governor Greg Abbott declared school choice an emergency item during his State of the State address last Sunday, allowing legislators to fast-track the proposal earlier in the legislative session than they otherwise would. During debate on the Senate floor, Senator Royce West questioned the bill's author, Republican Senator Brandon Creighton, about segregation as a result of the bill. West also raised questions about how the bill will support low-income families due to its $156,000 limit for qualifying families. Other Democratic senators said the bill will not help rural families. Now the bill is headed off to the House.
The 89th Texas Legislature convened January 14th. Propositions on the docket include constructing a high-speed railway connecting San Antonio, Austin, and Dallas along I-35. The proposed railway would travel at speeds of at least 110 miles per hour and is an effort to reduce vehicle emissions and accidents. Another item concerns additional protections for renters, with a bill that would protect renters from eviction by ensuring landlords provide at least 7 days' notice of rent increase, among other securities. House Bill 530 and Senate Bills 395 and 743 propose to ban local governments from offering guaranteed income programs. These are currently offered to low-income families facing threats of homelessness or eviction. Another bill would aid first-year business owners by waiving all licensing and registration business fees, making business startups more accessible. Finally, HB 1770 would raise the basic allotment of annual school funding from $6,160 to $7,500. The Texas Legislature meets once every 2 years, and the 89th session will continue until June 2nd.
Thank you so much for joining me, McKenna. Tower Talks will be back next week on Monday night. Be sure to follow us on social media at TSTV News on X, formerly Twitter, and at Tower Talks TSTV on Instagram. There, you'll be able to find out when our next episode will be in 2025 and the topics being covered. Check us out at tstvnews.com online and subscribe to our newsletter, Newsroom Notes. From all of us here in the studio, thank you for joining us this evening, and good night.